Is there anything more relaxing than going fishing? You're out in the nature, can enjoy the weather, listen to the birds singing and can catch a couple of fish for dinner. All the everyday stress just falls off. For me, for a couple of hours there's nothing else but myself, nature and rest. Okay, admittedly a couple of beers as well. But you know how it is. Every fisherman has the biggest catch. Every ever so small little roach or rat becomes a giant 80-pound carp or 8-foot catfish. Fishermen are in no way inferior to any old sailor when it comes to spinning a yarn. That's why I don't really like talking about my catches. I usually release them back into the water anyways. I only keep my catch when I am in the mood for some fish to eat and my catch is big enough to be served for dinner. Apart from this one exception, I don't care all that much about what I reel in. It's the quiet and seclusion that are more important to me. I've not been fishing for quite some time, however. I wear a support corset and I'm not allowed to put any strain on my back. My wife jokes all the time about how I, at the very moment I'm allowed to, would be back on the lake to catch some fish again. I'm not all that sure about that though. Yes, I did use every minute I could spare to go fishing because I loved it. But I put this in past tense for a reason. As a matter of fact, I'm scared of that lake. I'm scared of visiting it, let alone driving out onto it. Especially of the latter. It started like every other fishing trip ever. There's a beautiful lake just a couple of miles from our home. It's in a forested area, fitted with several private jetties and little boathouses. One of these belongs to me, including a small motor boat I made a dream come true for myself with. I arrived pretty late at home. My already planned trip to the lake got stalled by unexpected overtime. The sun was already setting when I arrived home, but due to it having been a Friday, I decided to stick to my plan and just go for some night fishing instead. Said and done. I grabbed my fishing rods from the basement, took a couple of beers in a plastic bag as well, and fetched all the gear I thought I might need. Landing net, bait, spare parts, fishing knife and so on packed, I took off in my car. From time to time my wife enjoys accompanying me on these trips, but that day she was just too tired already. I don't know if I should be thankful for this. On one hand, this way at least one person on this earth would have believed me. On the other hand, who knows what might have happened if she also would have been out on the lake that night. I loaded everything onto the boat, opened the boathouse and drove out on the water. A couple of 100 feet out, I cast my primary rod, fitted with ground lead and a nice big pack of red worms for anything that might have been hungry at the bottom of the lake. I was secretly hoping for a nice carp, but as usual, any catch would have been just fine. I put a little bell at the very end of the rod to alarm me if a fish might take the bait while I was tending to my secondary rod. This I cast into the opposite direction from my first one. I made myself as comfortable as I could and decided it was time to get the most of the fresh, clean air. I took a deep breath and opened my first beer. It's moments like this when you tend to forget time. Before I realized, it was already deep night. A starry sky fitted with a generous new moon provided very good visibility despite the time. Other than that, the glow stick on my secondary rod's swimmer and my headlamp provided additional light. My headlamp was mostly turned off though. I only used the additional light for when I needed to put new bait on the hooks or had to do anything that required precision work and thus a good illumination. Several hours, beers and bites later, I was still sitting there and watched basically nothing if I'm truly honest. I didn't even pay attention to my fishing rods at all. I was just staring out to the lake and its mirror-smooth water surface. The shore was a good couple of 100 feet away in every direction. Some isolated small lights stemming from the campfires or bungalows were to be seen, but other than that, there was nothing but the moon, the water, my fishing rods and the fish themselves. And then there was that frantic ringing of the bell, accompanied by the sharp tone of the fishing line being hastily and seemingly effortlessly pulled through the rings of my rod, even though I put the brake at half power. Something took my bait. Something really big and strong. and it was about to not only take off with said bait, but with my whole rod as well. I hastily reached for the rod, adjusted the brake and started to reel in. This thing was damn fast and just as powerful. Everything I tried to counter it was like a drop in the ocean. The rod was bending to an extent that made me fear it would break any moment. I opened the spin and let the fish run loose for a while in hopes of tiring itself out enough to be landed. I was lucky it didn't run off immediately and took up all the line, or else that would have been the end of it. My catch pulled frantically left and right before heading directly towards my boat. I tried to reel in as much line as I could before it would change directions again. However, I didn't make much progress, only a couple of feet. This catch was so fast that I could barely keep up with it. It changed directions at an unimaginable pace and with an aggression I've never seen before. You can feel the fish's moves in your own arms when you reel them in. The bigger and stronger the fish is, the more clearly you feel it trying to get off the hook, working with all its power against you. This beast was so strong it generated a force and speed that was unlike anything I've ever seen. Single short moves were able to put an immense strain on my gear and my arms. This thing was a real fighter. I don't know for how long we fought. It definitely felt like hours. My arms were hurting, my muscles cramped, but honestly, it was probably a fight of just a couple of minutes and I was just badly out of shape. But one thing I do know. A couple of times I nearly got pulled out of the boat by the sheer power of this fish. In the end, however, the inevitable happened. The fishing line simply snapped. My opponent swam away victoriously while I stumbled backwards. I felt pretty hard on my behind and rocked the boat with my massive butt pretty vigorously. I actually had trouble preventing it from turning over, but luckily I got the job done. Exhausted and with a pretty hurt ego and buttocks, I remained seated, huffed a couple of times and opened a cold one. What a fight, I thought to myself. Too bad I didn't get to catch that beast, but hey. I couldn't stop myself from giggling a bit while taking a big sip from the beer. It was a wild bout with a well-deserved win for the fish. I thought the line would snap way sooner, to be perfectly honest. It was not a very strong line that I put on a reel. That said, it held up surprisingly well. Way better than I expected. I made a mental note to from now on buy my fishing line from that specific brand exclusively. I started picking up the bits and pieces of gear and spare parts I spilled all over the place when I knocked over my tackle box falling into it. I was damn lucky I didn't fall into my fish knife. Whew, that could have ended very ugly. You really need to get used to packing and stowing away your gear properly, boy, I mumbled to myself. I put everything back into the box after looking over the place multiple times to not overlook a hook or anything. While I prepared a new leader, hook and ground lead to my line, I heard the water next to me getting disturbed. Next to my boat, a lot of fish started moving right under the surface. It looked like they were fleeing from something. Of course, I immediately thought of a big predator. There was something that forced all the other fish to flee. I stopped my repairs to take a closer look. The boat slowly rocked from side to side from the little waves that hit it. I watched the small lines that became visible due to the back fins of the fish, and they appeared like little incisions in the water surface. I was fascinated by the amount of fish in direct proximity to me, and by the size of a couple of them as well. The very next moment, I nearly fell back on my ass again. Out of nothing, a giant, and I do mean giant, catfish came rushing to the surface from the deep dark abyss below. I don't know how large this monstrosity exactly was, but if I had to guess, I would say this was more than 6 foot 6 inches, maybe even up to 8 foot 2 inches. Its maw was big enough to easily put my head in, and maybe even my shoulders. This beast jumped out of the water and snapped after a couple of smaller fish it had driven to the surface. God, no wonder this thing got away, I thought to myself. I was absolutely ill-equipped for anything of that size. On the bright side, I now had an awesome story to tell. My very own yarn that, as true as it was, no one would have believed me. Just as like the rest of the night. Huffing in admiration, I grabbed my fishing rod and continued repairing my gear. At that moment, my second rod showed a bite. That catfish had seemingly run another fish right into my bait. Again, I stopped my repairs to reel in the catch. After I fought that giant, this was child's play in comparison. Still, this one seemed to be of pretty good size as well, more than enough to serve as lunch. The aching in my arms I was expecting to have the next day would not be in vain then. I reeled in my consolation prize, giving it some space to move, and exhausted itself every so often. It was your old cat and mouse game, until suddenly a sharp whipping sound echoed through the night. The line snapped again. This time, however, it didn't feel like this was my catch's doing. Something else had torn my catch directly off my line, ripping it apart immediately. Again! At that point, I felt frustration rise in me. That catfish had something against me. I contemplated packing up and going home, but ultimately decided against it. I was nearly done repairing my ground rod and just wanted to try casting out one last time. However, I refrained from even starting to repair my second rod and pushed that task to the next day. With a big, aggressive and hungry monster like this around, it was way easier to take care of just a single rod. Otherwise, it was just a matter of time before at least one of them would have been pulled into the water. After I put away the broken rod, I again recognized the sound of unrest in the water. The fish were on the run again. Apparently, the catfish had still some space for a dessert. I turned right to watch the water, opened another beer and looked for where from the catfish would appear this time. This is a sight you don't get to witness every day, especially from that close. I found the lines in the water easily. The little furrows in the surface had something eerily elegant to them. Synchronized, fast, but without feeling panicky or nervous. At least, that's how it was until the catfish got too close. It had something hypnotizing to it. Even though I was still pissed about my 2 lost catches and broken gear, watching this hypnotic and calming event was kind of a consolation. In the end, however, I of course wanted to continue what I was there for, so I switched on my headlamp and tried to concentrate on tying my new leader to the line. I always had problems with that kind of fiddly work. I'm simply not made for that, I believe. In light of the situation, however, I think the multiple beers I already had might have had something to do with it as well. At least they most likely didn't help. I managed to tie my leader back to the fishing line, accompanied by the distant cries of an owl that echoed over the lake. A couple of times the water did stir up again, followed by the familiar sound of fish trying to escape a predator by jumping out of the water. Of course, I looked over again to check what was going on. The fish raced towards my boat, followed by an inconspicuous big wave. Whilst all the other fish sooner or later changed direction, however, that predator simply continued on its path right towards me. I of course was convinced that it would simply dive under my boat and never shed a second thought about it. Just as expected, shortly before reaching me, the wave simply faded away and everything went quiet again. Suddenly, I felt something massive strike my boat from below, and it struck it with a fierce force. It actually felt like this was no accident but on purpose. I was lucky to already have sat down, or otherwise I would have definitely gone overboard. The shock, however, was deep. The catfish could not possibly have mistaken my boat for any sort of fish, especially not prey. As big as that thing was, it didn't nearly have the size to even consider my vessel as such. I tried to convince myself that the catfish simply followed actual prey and just slammed into my boat on accident. Still, if you feel a force like this suddenly crash into you, rocking the boat violently enough to give you a hard time keeping yourself from falling out, that's scary as hell. Especially when knowing about what kind of monster is lurking in the depths below you. I inevitably had to think about killer whales. Orcas use this kind of tactical approach to throw seals off of ice floes to eat them. I know, this was simply a big catfish that despite his size would most likely not have been able to swallow me down, but it was more than enough to pull me under and drown me. Now I knew how the seals must have felt before their demise. I clung to the edges of the boat in a vain attempt to stabilize it. That's at least what I told myself. Cheers to human thumbs. I leaned left and right, hoping to find a sign of my adversary. I was wishing for something that showed me it would wander off, ideally for good. Even if it wouldn't have made me shit my pants just a moment earlier, it simply ate half of my possible catches and scared away the rest. For a moment, everything went silent and peaceful again. The waves my rocking boat produced wandered over the water, and from far away the owl was still calling out. Then, my boat got hit a second time. It got hit in the stern so hard it got actually lifted out of the water to some extent. This fish was unbelievable. I have never ever experienced such an incredible display of aggression and strength in a fish. This time it sent me flying face first towards the ground. I planted my face directly onto the bench at the bow of my boat. Through all the noise I made as my upper body and hands crashed through my gear and tackle box, I still could hear a very audible crunch. The nose was broken. Everything hurt immediately anyways, so I didn't realize the extent of my injury right away, as I basically hit everywhere. Looking around in a panic, huffing and breathing heavily, I tried to push myself up again. If I didn't know better, I'd have said that this catfish was out to get me. But did I know better? This, however, was the moment I realized I had to get off the water. Immediately. In the meantime, my boat got hit over and over again. It ran into my boat's hull with all its power, dove back down into the deep, and attacked from the opposite side again. Every hit pushed the boat out of the water now. Keeping myself from falling down or even out of it became a gamble. Strength and balance alone were not cutting it anymore. I laid down and tried to make myself as small as possible so I couldn't fall out of the boat as easily, unless it would capsize. However, as the situation presented itself, exactly this was just a matter of time. I had to get out of there. Lying on my belly, I tried to reach for the boat engine. This thing was to be started with a pull starter, however, and getting it to run from a lying position was next to impossible. I had only one option. I had to wait for a time window between the attacks. I was convinced by now that what happened was nothing but an attack. As soon as such an opportunity would show itself, I would jump up and try to get the engine running as fast as possible, hopefully on first try even. Phase 2 of my plan was much simpler. Floor it and get out of there. Said and done. I lay on my side and drew my knees up. After the next push, I rolled left belly, got up on my knees and yanked the starter pull like it was a matter of life and death, because that's what it felt like. Thank goodness the engine actually started straight away. I hit the gas hard, wanting to get away from that lake as fast as I could, but I just couldn't move. This piece of shit just wouldn't budge. And then came the next push that nearly ripped me off the boat again. With great difficulty, I was able to catch myself on the throttle and the side of the boat again. Otherwise, that would have been it for me. Panic was slowly taking over. Dropping to my knees, I flipped the engine up out of the water to see what the hell was going on. I kept glancing up, head ducked as if peering out from cover in a firefight. At that moment, I probably would have preferred to look down the barrel of a gun instead of seeing what was in front of me with the engine. The screw was gone. Torn off. That bastard must have dismembered my engine when it hit the boat on the stern with the second impact. I was absolutely certain by now that it knew exactly what it was doing. As absurd as that notion felt, it wasn't a fucking coincidence anymore. I was screwed. No engine, no oars to spare, no chance of escape. Except, maybe, the landing net. Triangular in shape, white contact surface. If I could seal that. The damn plastic bag. My gear could save my ass. I grabbed the net, pulled the bag to me and rummaged through the gear that was now strewn all over the floor. Lying on my stomach again, I began to put the bag over the landing net. The next hit lifted the boat by the bow, corkscrewing it to starboard. Even lying down, I wasn't safe anymore. Just a little more and I would definitely go overboard no matter how I positioned myself in the boat. I hastily grabbed one of the steel leaders, wrapped it around the bag and landing net, hooked the carabiner on one end into the eyelet of the other end of the leader and fuck yes, improvised oar. But getting away with that fast enough was still not possible. I would have never had the speed to outrun that beast. Not to mention that I would just have had to sit up for the effort needed to get away as quickly as possible. But I couldn't just hold out either. That would have been my literal downfall. I was trying desperately to sort my thoughts, to stay clear and structured, but that was far easier said than done. I was still lying on my stomach on the bottom of the boat, panting frantically and trying to plan, when the next hit caught the bottom of the boat right where I was lying. I felt the hull rise out of the water just below the pit of my stomach, and the boat began to tip over. It was right below me. I cried out briefly. Panic and desperation were beginning to overwhelm me, but I just couldn't let that happen. So I couldn't just lie there and hold out, but I couldn't get myself out of the danger zone effectively either. There were only two options left. Freeze and surrender to the situation, or somehow attack myself, and I was about to fall for the former. With the courage of desperation, I began to search for the fish knife. It had to be somewhere in between all the other shit. My body was so pumped with adrenaline that I probably wouldn't even have known if I already had fallen on it. Behind my tackle box, my fingers found the sharp end of the blade. Yes, it was definitely sharp enough to do a ton of damage. I pulled it towards me, clutching the handle, hoping the blood from my now cut hand wouldn't make it too slippery, and held on. I waited for the inevitable capsizing of my boat, my own immersion into the water, in the territory and worse, element of my opponent. The moment you are absolutely convinced that you are in a hopeless situation, that you are unlikely to survive, your body begins to react strangely to this realization. It becomes quiet, downright deaf, impervious to external influences. In a way, you stop thinking. Reflexes and automatisms take over. It's kinda creepy how suddenly all fear and even sanity seems to vanish. As if the instinct of self-preservation, which just a moment ago determined absolutely everything down to the last detail, was completely switched off, or rather given up on. At that moment, I was only after one thing. If I were to die, I'd take this bastard down with me. I got on my knees, trying to spot where the next attack would come from, looking for those ominous ripples in the water. Not an easy task when your own boat is rocking back and forth so violently, churning up the water itself. And then, there they were again. Those unmistakable swaths, cutting through the waves of my swaying boat like nothing. The pace was frightening. I barely had time to really brace myself for the impact. But I knew if it was about to lift my boat out of the water again, I would try to lean over the side of the boat and swing the fish knife at it. I would definitely go overboard, but I didn't care anymore. It didn't matter. This small chance of being able to catch it out of dry, and thereby in full force, was the only chance I thought I had, and I couldn't let it go to waste. The hit against the boat was harder than any before. It finally wanted me off the boat. I could see this massive, dark, scaly mass slide under the side of the boat and begin to lift it out of the water. After at least 1.5 feet, which it drove up the boat with me in it, it slipped off the hull and slid along the hull towards the edge of the boat. With a yelp of panic, or maybe it was a last desperate battle cry, I slammed the knife down with all my might. The water churned up frantically, splashing wildly through the area. I stumbled backwards. The shock of the boat hitting the water and the violent swaying knocked me off my feet again. I made myself as small as I could out of reflex, and thank God just prevented myself from disembarking. I banged my back hard against the side of the boat. The hit had landed. I must have knocked out a disc doing this, I thought, because every damn movement suddenly hurt like my spine was going to be broken. I could hardly move. It felt like my vertebrae had suddenly rusted solid. If I had gone overboard now, that would have been the end. Even if this beast had then disappeared directly, I wouldn't have been able to keep my head above water on my own. But I knew I had hit this thing. Even more so, I could feel the knife piercing the wood of my punt as I struck. I nailed that bastard against the side of the boat. In excruciating pain, I tried to somehow roll over onto all fours and wipe the water from my face and eyes. I couldn't stop now. I had to follow up, make sure that bastard died. Like a baby just learning to crawl, I gradually turned back towards this thing. It hit the side of the boat hardly and wildly, again and again, but it was definitely stuck. Groaning, I slowly pushed myself up onto the edge of the boat. Whimpering in pain and exhaustion, I tried to somehow pull myself up to finish what I had started. With all my strength, I pushed myself over the edge of the boat with my upper body to grab the knife and stab at the catfish again. With the back injury, that was now feeling almost impossible though. And even if I miraculously would have been able to pull out the knife from the boat, this bastard would have simply disappeared again immediately anyways. Still, I had to at least try, I told myself. Had it freed itself and continued its attacks, that would have been it either way. No matter how I twisted and turned it, it was far from over. So, I had no choice. But when I looked down at the fuselage, everything suddenly went back to square one. My determination to finish off this fish gave way to panic again. Sheer damn panic. What I had pinned to the boat was not a damn catfish. It wasn't even a fish at all. It was a fucking arm. A bloody damn hand with damn webbed fingers and shimmering black-green scales twitched under the steel and tried convulsively to free itself from the side of the boat. It ripped and tugged at the blade like a maniac, but I had jammed the knife so deep into the hull of my boat that fucking... whatever that animal was stuck stapled between the wood and the knife handle. I jerked my torso up out of pure reflex, cried out in shock and pain in equal measure. I got dizzy and nauseous, and it wasn't due to the wild swaying of the boat or the beer I had been drinking. Out of the depths of the water, black eyes round as marbles reflected the light of the moon. They flashed wildly and frighteningly through the rising air bubbles. No blinks, no discernible movement of the iris, nothing. Just blank, cold, dead stares. And then there were these pointed, cone-shaped teeth that shone no less in the water than the black marbles. Before I even realized what the hell I was looking at, the boat began to rock again. It grabbed the edge of the boat with its other hand, trying to get a hold on me. But with the rocking and my back injury, I fell over immediately and escaped the grasp of this thing. I sat there trying to ignore my excruciating pain, pressed against the far side of the boat, staring at the damn hand that was trying to grab me wildly and blindly, with my steel leader and a piece of fishing line sticking out. I never hooked a damn catfish. That hand, fin, whatever that was, withdrew again, and for a second everything calmed down. Then there was a single, sudden and violent jolt. The boat rocked wildly on the water, but it didn't rock as high as the times before. The wild rushing and splashing of the turbulent water from just before subsided, and then everything went quiet. I waited for what felt like an eternity for this piece of shit to come and finish me off for good. I had certainly made it really mad now, and it would now do everything to take revenge. I was absolutely sure of that. I had gotten to the point where I didn't even dare to stretch my hand over the edge of the boat to reach for the fish knife in the hull, just to stand a chance. I just sat there, slowly sinking to the floor bit by bit, and let tears of fear roll down my face. But nothing further happened. Eventually, I caught myself enough to take my chance. I couldn't and didn't want to wait any longer to see if this thing would come back for revenge after all. I didn't want to sit and wait, frozen stiff from fear like a terrified prey, and wait for my end on this lake in the middle of the night. Groaning, I grabbed my improvised paddle and began paddling from the supposed safety of lying down in the hull of the boat. Even if I wanted to do it differently, I couldn't even straighten up properly at that moment. Every move was torture. My body was absolutely wrecked. So I decided to just stay lying down and paddle until I reached shore, no matter in which direction. The main task was to get off this goddamn lake. It took at least an hour until I finally reached land. When my boat hit the shore, my whole body convulsed in shock. Immediately I thought the monster had come back. I remained frozen in place, despite the unimaginable pain from the spasms, and my body's reflex to force itself into a kind of relieving posture, until I slowly but surely became aware of where this hit against the boat was coming from. Slowly, using what little strength and stamina I had, I pushed my battered body over the edge of the boat and, lying on my stomach, pulled and pushed as far away from the shore as I could. I definitely didn't want this bastard to follow me and drag me back into the water from the supposed saving land. Unless that fucking thing was amphibious and could walk. It had hands, so why not feet too? I dragged myself a couple of dozen feet into the forest, where, barely conscious from the pain, I lay behind a birch in the middle of a wild boar wallow facing the lake. I was finished. Even the last bit of adrenaline that was released when I hit the bank was gone. My body was completely drained. I couldn't move a damn muscle. My back was completely destroyed. Everything hurt. And when I realized that my body was finally failing me, and I was on the verge of losing consciousness, my last thought was that I would rather be at the mercy of a pack of wild boar than this thing. My rescue appeared on 4 paws in the form of a golden retriever in the dawn. His curiosity prompted him to nudge me and bring me out of faint, sleep, or whatever condition I had succumbed to. I immediately cried out in panic, then in shock and ultimately in pain. It also frightened the poor dog. He jumped backwards and started barking at me. It took me a moment to orient myself. I thought, or rather even hoped for a moment, that it was all just a bloody nightmare I was having while I was drunk. However, my body aching all over, my inability to move very much, and a direct view of my wrecked boat, from whose hull the blood-smeared fish knife was still sticking out, told a completely different story. I stared at the wreck and the lake behind it, over which the sun was just rising, as if this horrific event never had happened.